Good morning, everybody. Because we're talking about change, and change is difficult, and today, step 3 is actually particularly difficult compared to all the other ones, I thought I'd get you laughing at first, because if you can't laugh at yourself, then it's hard to continue on with difficult things. So today, there's 2 words that describe step 3, surrender and submission. And so to make the point and get you laughing, I'll take you into the wonderful but really horrible and disturbing world of college wrestling. This week, I took my boys up to watch my old team wrestle, and I was reminded of just how strange college wrestlers are. And one of the things that we used to do for fun is we wouldn't wrestle around. You know, guys, young guys especially, like to horse around and wrestle with each other, but wrestlers don't like to wrestle with one another. They like to tap each other out. And so we used to play this game, submission fighting, where you try to lock a guy's joints out and they tap out, or you get him in a chokehold, and it was fun. But because we were so very, very weird, we thought it would be fun to try to get guys to submit or choke them out in the strangest places. And so there were stories of wrestlers choking their teammates out in the middle of class, in the lunchroom, in their dorm room. One day, I was brought in on this horrible, humorous event or thing that they used to do. I was on the training table, getting my ankles taped, my knees, which are a mess, were getting iced, and one of my teammates comes up behind me while this female trainer is taping my ankles and puts me in a chokehold. Begins to choke me out right there on the table. And if you've ever been choked out, which hopefully you haven't, and I don't even know why I would think if you've ever been choked out, but I'll just tell you what it's like. At first, you try to turn and face the person so you can kind of defend yourself. But if they got a good chokehold on you, there's no turning. They're right behind you. And then you try to pull down their arms to loosen the grip around your neck so that you can breathe. But you quickly realize that you can't do that as well. And it just takes a matter of seconds. But within about 5 seconds of resisting, you realize that there's nothing that you can do to get out of this. You can start tapping their shoulder saying, "I'm about to fall asleep." Or you can just relax and go with it. And so that day, I knew, because it was one of my teammates, that he wasn't going to let me go for tapping out. So I just, after about 5 seconds of fighting, just relaxed. He put me out right on the table. And the poor female trainer is screaming, terrified at what she just saw in front of her. And so she begins to panic. She wakes me up. And we reassure her that we do this all the time and that everything is perfectly safe. All right, why did I tell you that story? Step 3, surrender and submission, is about realizing that you're in a chokehold because of your struggle, that there's nothing that you can do to get out of it, and that you just give in a sense. But you don't just give in to the horrible experience, you give in to God working in your life. And so step 3 means to surrender your own will and to submit to God's will. And so what we're doing is we're in a series called Metamorphosis, and it's a 14-week series where we lay out biblical principles about change in a particular order that we believe works. And we're loosely following the 12 steps. It's just a very successful program when you compare it to other programs about helping people change from significant things in their life. We've asked everyone who comes during this series to identify one area of their life that they'd like to see changed. And we're not just talking surface level things, but issues of their character. And last week, I ended the message by asking you to imagine what it would be like if, with God, things began to change. That you got a picture of the future where you were free from whatever it is that you're struggling with, or your thought patterns changed, or the relationship changed. How would things how would they be better? And to imagine it. Well, today I want to ask you another what if question, but it goes the other way. What if we don't change? What's going to be the result if we continue to struggle with whatever that one thing is? And remember I said, think of the one thing being put in a box. What we do with our struggles is we put them in like this box in our heart, and we can do 3 things with that box. We can use the box to hide it from the rest of the world. That's what we do with our struggles. It's what we do with our addictions, our bad habits, our pain. We put it in a box and we hide it from other people. We put it in the box so that we can avoid it. And we put it in the box because we believe that we have the strength to manage it on our own to make sure it doesn't get too bad. So imagine if you don't open that box with God, change doesn't take place, how will life be different? Because it won't stay the same. Things that are unhealthy just grow. Things that are dead kill more things. It's just how life works. So I want you to imagine, what will it be like if you don't continue in this process of change? And the reason I say that is because step 3 and step 4 are very difficult. A friend of mine told me this week in the 12-step world that it's around steps 3 and 4 that people begin to tap out. They're done. It's too hard. An author that we're reading for this series says that step 3 and step 4, to surrender your will and to submit to God's, it feels like dying. It always does. Everything works backwards. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't come naturally to us. So we need to have some courage. We need to have some motivation. We need to get to this place where we're willing to continue on. So step 3, to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. And you can remember these two words, surrender and submission. And this is what I mean by that. Surrendering our will, our wisdom, our plans, our power, and our efforts to say that I'm not wise enough. I don't have the strength enough to change myself. And then in the process of surrendering that, we submit to God's will and God's wisdom and God's plan and God's power and God's efforts in our life. This is very, very difficult to do. This principle is found throughout the Bible. I want to show you Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 and 13 today. It's just one of them that explains this. This is what Paul says. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my presence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And then verse 13 is the key. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. It's God who works in you. And so if you add this principle on the first one is to live in reality, to stop pretending and stop hiding that we are broken, that we have difficulties and struggles that are hurting us and other people. Step 2 is to say, I'm going to take that box and I'm going to open it up with God, thinking that God might actually help me. And step 3 is to actually surrender our efforts, our will, our plan on changing what's inside, saying, I've got nothing left. To submit to God, say, God, all I've got is you. You're the only one that can return me to health and to sanity. For it is God that works in us. And so I want to spark this in us. But I do know this. You can't make a person ready with a message to surrender or submit. You have to get there on your own. I can't motivate you today to continue on in step 3. So what I want to do is I just want to describe it and explain it to you. So that when you are ready, whatever it is, whatever the motivation is, maybe life falls apart, and then you're ready, you'll remember this, and that you can continue on. All right, I want to explain 3 things about step 3. First of all, that it's harder than you expect. Second, that it's better than you expect. And number 3, that it's not what you expect. And I'm going to go through all 3 of those things. Step 3, giving up control. All right, think of it this way. Think of a time in your life when you can continue to struggle. Maybe it's right now. And what happens is when you've identified some area of your life that's unhealthy, you say, I want to get better at it. And usually what we do is we follow this pattern. We struggle, we fail, and we say, okay, next time, I'm going to be more prepared. Next time, I'm going to try harder. Next time, I'm going to do things differently. But what usually happens with real issues that need change in life is that we continue to fail and we get trapped in this pattern that is really built by an illusion that we are in control of our lives. Or trapped in the illusion, for the sake of this series, that we are in the illusion that we can control and manage our own struggles or the change that needs to take place in our life. And so what we do is when we fail, we just try to control things more. The environment. Maybe our health, the people around us. And we think that with more effort and a better plan and new ideas that we will be able to handle the things in our life that are killing us and other people. It's an illusion. There's no amount of control that can ever restore us to our health or our sanity on our own. Nothing. It's not a person strong enough to do that. And so there's an alternative to this than trying to control ourselves and change ourselves, and that is total surrender. I'm surrendering my efforts, and I'm now submitting to God's efforts in my life. And when this happens, God is able to work in our life when we actually, and here's the term, we give up control. We let go of whatever it is so that we can cling to God. We let go of all past plans and failures and all future attempts at changing things and give in. But really not just give in, but we give in to God. Now, there's a great story that illustrates this. There's an old Chinese pastor who wrote several books. His name is Watchman Nee. Many of you have read some of his stories. But he has a story about a time when he was at a camp with a number of friends, and they were swimming in a large river. And one of the friends was kind of wading in the water and kept moving out further and further into the water until finally he found himself in a dangerous situation. He was out so deep in the river that he couldn't touch the bottom, and he really struggled as a swimmer. And so he began to panic, and he began to yell to the shore for help. And Watchman was standing there. He was watching what was taking place, and he knew that he wasn't a strong enough swimmer to go in and save that man. But he knew that one of their friends that was also there at the camp that's standing there on the beach was strong enough. And so Watchman turns to the friend on the beach and says, "You need to run in there and you need to save our friend. He's drowning." And the man does nothing. And Watchman looks back at the river and sees that his friend continues to struggle. He turns back to the friend on the beach and he says, "You've got to go get him. He's going to die." And then he begins to shove the man towards the water, because the man is not moving. And the man resists, and he digs in his heels, and he just stands there, and he waits. And they both begin to watch. And Watchman finally gives up. He says, "There's no hope for this man because the one guy that can save him is not going in." And about that time, the man in the water kind of gave his last effort, and his head dipped below the surface. It was at that time that the man on the beach that he had been pleading with to go save his friend is in the water. He gets to this friend, and he pulls him to shore safely. Watchman says that he was so angry when the man pulled him from the water. And he looked at the friend, the hero, and he said, "How could you do that to him and to me and to all of us? How could you wait so long before you would go in there and save him? We were scared to death." And the man that was the strong swimmer said, I've saved a lot of people. I've seen this happen before, and I know that if I was to enter that water before the man had given up, he would grab a hold of both of us and pull us both down. It was only when he was exhausted that I could save him. It was only when he had given up that I could safely grab him and pull him to shore. See, it's that way with God in a number of areas of our life, but especially in issues that need to change. We need to get to the place where we are done struggling ourselves, and we say to God, "It's fully surrendered, and I'm going to submit it all to you." It's at that point that God can work in our life. I know what this feels like also. Last week I shared that years ago, Elise and I were really struggling in our marriage. I knew that things needed to change, so I was trying really, really hard to become a better husband and to fix our marriage. We were even going to counseling. But I was missing some ingredient, and that ingredient was that I hadn't surrendered or submitted to God completely. I still believed that I was able to fix this on my own. Like every one of us still believe that. And it wasn't till this moment, people refer to these moments as epiphany. I think God just spoke. He broke through something in me, my pride, that I was in a courtyard in Mexico leading a mission trip, thinking my marriage is about to fail, that I finally got to the place where I said, I have nothing left. All of my attempts to save myself, fix myself, have failed. God, you've got to do it. See, the only thing that changed that day for me, because I was trying before, I was going to counseling, doing good things. The only change that day, the only thing that changed is that I surrendered my will, my efforts, my wisdom, my power, and submitted to God's wisdom, His efforts, His power to make a difference. And that's exactly what happened. I think it's the same thing that happened for Elise in a different way. See, we all have to get here, and we get here in different ways. But to get to this place where we give up control, it's a lot harder than we think to actually be there. It's a good idea, maybe, although no one likes to surrender or submit, but it's really difficult. Remember that quote I mentioned earlier, that surrender always feels like death? It does. And that's why Jesus said things all the time that were kind of upside down. Jesus said things, and Luke and Matthew both record this. It says, if you want to save your life, you have to lose it. If you want to be first, you have to be last. And then John tells the story about a kernel of wheat that has to fall to the ground and die so that it can produce life. See, it really does feel like you're dying. It really does feel humiliating. It's so difficult. But when you experience that, you can be assured that you're on the right path, that you're on the path to surrender and submission. It is never easy to bend your will to someone else's. I mean, think of children. I have 4 little boys. They're all different. But one thing that they have in common is that about the age of 1, when they can walk and they begin to make sounds and they have some freedom to make their own choices, they are constantly pushing their will on everyone else. And kids know, right? Mom and dad are in charge. But even as an infant, or a toddler, little Jude right now is testing his will to ours all the time. And unfortunately, we have 4 different versions of testing our will, and we're about to have a teenager. And so we're really going to learn what this is like in the next few years. But kids do this. But we don't outgrow this. As adults, I know a number of people who in their adult life, they have never, ever once submitted to anyone. They can't submit to a boss, so they can't keep a job. They can't submit to things like the institution of marriage or the idea of marriage or to a spouse, and so because of that, they can never have a healthy relationship. They can't submit to friends, so because of that, they never have true friendships. It's possible today. It will lead to a lot of pain, but it is possible today as adults to never, ever surrender your will and submit your will to someone else. And so it's very possible, even as followers of Jesus, to have never done this with God. To never say, God, you're with me. It's one thing to know that you're with me. It's another thing entirely for me to submit to you, especially in the areas of something as precious and secret and important as what's in that box. Submission and surrender are very, very difficult. But this is an absolute must for lasting change. This is where we stop when we can't get past this. As a pastor, and all our pastors here, we spend a lot of time with people who enter into our office or we meet for coffee, and we meet and we talk about changes that people want to make in their life. And so sometimes they just get there on their own. They say, I'm sick and tired of this. I need some help. Several years ago, I had a friend that was an 11-year cocaine addiction. He shows up in my office and says, I struggle with this. I want to change. There are other people that are in there because their spouse sends them. There are other people that come and meet with us and say, I want to change because they hear something in a sermon and they hope that they'll sit down with a pastor and will say something that will change their life in the moment. That advice does not exist from us, at least. Change is a lot harder than that. But one of the things that we always listen to for, and it's the same thing that sponsors in 12-step programs listen for, is we listen to what they're saying to figure out, are they really ready? Are they willing to do anything it takes to be free from this, to change from this? And when you hear them say, I'm going to do this, next time I'm going to try this, when they have a resistance to submitting to good feedback and instruction, we all know that they're not really ready to change. And in a way, we're thinking, hey, you need to go away. Since we're pastors, we have to be nice. We have to, we talk to them, but in our mind, we're really thinking, nothing's going to change. I'll see you back here in a year or in 6 months. Because they're not ready. When you haven't given up, you are not ready to really change. Doesn't mean that you're giving up on the process of change. It means you're giving up on your own efforts, your own will, that you've surrendered that and you're ready to submit to God. Now, what makes me feel better about this, that this is so hard, is that even Jesus, the greatest human that has ever lived, agonized about surrendering his will and submitting to God's. He agonized about it. Jesus had a plan for his life that he knew beforehand. It was a little different than ours. Jesus knew what he had to do with his life. But that night before he's killed, we're told that he's in the garden. Gene shared the story a couple of weeks ago, and he's agonizing over the choice of, do I continue? And the essence of the choice was this: will I surrender my will and submit to God's? Even Jesus, knowing that this act that he was about to do would save humanity, still had a hard time surrendering his will and submitting to God's. So that means if it was hard for him, it's a lot harder for us. But it is the path to life. We need to do this. We need to get to the place and say, all of my efforts are exhausted. I have nothing left. I'm going to turn to someone else. Now, this is where the process of change in step 3 gets better than you would expect. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talks in this general way about being in this desperate place. This place where you just kind of give up. But you just turn to God and say, you're all I've got. He says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. Simple verse. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You can think of blessed or blessed as things that are good. Someone that's been given certain gifts, that's in a good place in life. They've been cared for. It's not just happiness, but it's beyond that. It says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Here's one of those principles in the Bible that works upside down, just like you must die to live. Blessed are the poor in spirit. To be poor in spirit means more than to, as what we often think of, just to be sad. In fact, later on in one of the verses it says, blessed are those that grieve. But poor in spirit means something different entirely. And if you were to sum it up in one way, to be poor in spirit means that you have absolutely given up control and given it to God. That's what it means to be poor in spirit. To be poor in spirit means that you understand that poverty has stricken you in some area of your life, especially your heart, and that you have nothing in your bag of resources to care for yourself, save yourself, change yourself. And so, of course, this is the path to a relationship with God, to say, I cannot save myself, I need you. But it's also the path to change. I cannot change myself, God, I need you. But Jesus said, blessed are these people. Blessed are those that realize they have nothing, so they'll turn to the one that has everything. There are many reasons why being poor in spirit are a good thing, and I'm going to mention a few of them. The first one is when you finally get to this place where you're poor in spirit, you're willing, you're desperate, however you want to describe it, you've given up control. This is the attitude that God uses. God does not use the proud. God doesn't work in our independent determination. God works in our weakness, in our giving up, in our giving control away to him. God works when we are poor in spirit. I'll show you a picture here. This is kind of a cheesy kids game, but many of you might remember it. This game's called Chutes and Ladders. I played it as a kid. Now I have boys. I'm into all these games again. Did you know the fastest way to win in Chutes and Ladders is to hang around the bottom so that you can catch that really tall ladder? And so what happens is when you pass the tall ladder, which is the shortcut to the top, you're always like, oh, great, I've got to do things the hard way. And hopefully I'm not going to land on one of those chutes, one of those slides. It's going to take me back down. But you want to hang around the bottom down there, and hopefully, luckily, you'll land on that ladder, which is kind of the fast track. See, being poor in spirit is being down there around the bottom to catch that fast track. It doesn't mean that it comes quickly or easily, but it's the path to the top. Because what happens is when we don't find ourselves in this place where we're poor in spirit, we get to the top and we have to be taken back down and taken back down. So God uses this attitude. Second is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that we shared this last week. We see that this is where God releases his power for those people that admit they're powerless. God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. God's power is released to people who are empty. His wisdom is released to the person that says, I no longer rely on my own wisdom. His power is released to the person that says, I have none that can help me. It's the second benefit. Here's the third one. We find ourselves in this place of being poor in spirit. We find ourselves in the care and safety. We experience security with God. See, it's impossible to really surrender and submit to someone else unless you realize that they're good and safe, right? Same is true of God. But it's when we're in this moment that we have to be on the other end of this to realize that God actually does care for us. Isaiah 43 has just a great description of God's care. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. And I have summoned you by name, and you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Do not be afraid, he goes on to say, for I am with you. This desire to be safe and secure comes from God. He cares for us, and this is what we experience when we get to this place that we're ready. And here's some other good news about being poor in spirit. When you get to this place, sometimes, you've been broken and you're humble, and it's really, really hard to imagine life differently. It's hard to imagine your character being any different. But here's what's great when you turn to God. God doesn't have a hard time imagining something better for us. He's got a vision for all of our lives. He's got a picture of the person that he wants us to be. The husband, the wife, the friend, the parent, the child, the worker, the boss. He has a picture of this that he wants. And in Hebrews, it actually tells us this, that he is the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. God has a vision, and he's taking us there. But if we're leading ourselves, he can't lead us. But when we get to this place and put our hands up and say, all right, I'm done. I surrender. And I submit to you, God, we experience all these benefits. Now, one last thing about being poor in spirit. This is a question that comes up. How do you get to this place? what does it take to get us to this desperate place? Some people say only suffering. And that's one of the lessons of suffering, is that we're not in control, right? You realize that. You're suffering and there's nothing you can do to stop whatever it is that's causing you suffering. That's a lesson of suffering. Some people say only suffering. I think there's an additional way, and that's prayer. Now, this sounds easy and contrite, but it's not. A nurtured life of prayer where we go to God and we say, your will, not mine, and we let God show us the many little ways that we choose ourselves, our own will, our own power over his, over time begins to transform us. See, prayer is a gift. It's not just a place that we go and ask God for help or hear his voice and his encouragement, but it's a place that God actually transforms us. See, those that nurture a deep prayer life, and not because they must, but because they want to, they are putting themselves in the care of a person that will transform their heart and make them poor in spirit. So I believe that there's a way to be wise and proactive besides just experiencing suffering. But there's one other way, and I'm going to get to this in a moment. But it includes other people. So we're poor in spirit by suffering. We're poor in spirit by nurturing a life of prayer. But I also believe that we learn to be poor in spirit, to surrender and submit, by surrendering and submitting to others. You know, to submit to God means, of course, the obvious things, which means to obey the scriptures. It means, you know, it's really hard to turn to God and obey God unless you know what his book says. And so you need to spend time in the scriptures. You need to hear people teaching it. We all need this. And we need to learn to submit to God. For example, someone that's struggling in their marriage and they're wanting things to be better, they never really submit to God unless they stop that affair. Unless they follow the scriptures. You can't say I'm submitting to God, but I'm not obeying his scriptures. And so the obvious thing of what it means to submit to God is to obey his scriptures. But it means something that you wouldn't think. And so this is the part of surrender and submission that's not what we think of. To surrender and submit to God must always include surrendering and submitting to another person. Now, this makes some people feel uncomfortable because this leads to an opportunity for someone to abuse you, to control you. But there are many people in the world, including in our church, who have demonstrated care, humility, as they have authority over someone else. Now, here's what makes it safe for those of you that are afraid of submitting and surrendering to someone else. It's your choice. There's no boss. There's no king that's forcing you to do this. But if you really want to experience surrender and submission to God, it must include another person that you put yourself in the care of them. There are many benefits to submitting to someone else. Of course, they can put up a mirror and they can show you who you really are. They can see through the bowl. They know when we're hiding. They know when we're managing. They know that, so those are benefits. But here's the main benefit. You learn to surrender your will and submit to God by surrendering your will and submitting to other people. That's a gift that children are supposed to learn when they're kids, learning to obey and honor their parents. The reason they learn to do that is so that they might learn to submit and honor and obey God someday. So this step has to include other people. This is what God does. God cares for us through the care of other people. God encourages us through the attention of other people in our life. God's voice speaks to us through the voice of other people. God's leadership shows up in the leadership of other people. This is why during 12-step programs, they're quickly paired up with a sponsor. It's not just a buddy to go through the process with. It's someone that they are submitting to. And so for me, this person has shown up at many different times in different ways. For a few years, it was my parents. At other times, it was friends that were more experienced in the area I was struggling. When it was my marriage, it was my father-in-law and Jean. I needed my pastor. I needed my father-in-law. Today, it can be mentors. It can be small group leaders. Someone that you say, you know what? I'm serious about this. I'll do whatever it takes, and I'm going to put myself in the care of someone else who has demonstrated that they're a safe person. And so you surrender your will and you begin to submit to them. And of course, it takes some discernment to figure out where they start and end and where God begins and ends. But this is where God teaches us about submission and surrender. We have the choice to ask, so you don't have to be worried about the abuse that might come. Now, I want to give you an example of someone that needed this. So there's a man in the Bible that we're told had it might be the most unique, special relationship of anyone in the scriptures. His name was David, that we're told had special faith. He had a special love of God, special relationship with God. He talked to God all the time. Well, David fell off the tracks. He committed adultery and took another man's wife as his wife, and then to cover it up, and because he was the king and had the power to do this and the law behind it, he sends this man off to the front lines of a war so that he would make sure that he would surely die. And so that's exactly what happened. And David, who at times in his life he didn't have a hard time listening to God. He was connected to God. In this moment, had all of these blind spots. And so God used another person to hold up the mirror to help him. God used another person that David would have to submit to if he really meant to surrender and submit to God. He used a prophet, his friend named Nathan. And the story is great. And it takes place in 2 Samuel chapter 12. I'd encourage you to read it. But Nathan comes to David and tells him this story about a man who stole and took the property of someone else's and then committed a terrible crime to cover it up. And David, like the rest of us, you hear something like that. You're like, who did that? Let's punish him. Let's find him. That's terrible. And then we get this great line from Nathan. He just uses a few words. David says, who's the man? And Nathan looks at him and says, you're the man. You're the man. In that moment, God speaks to him. The mirror is held up of who he truly is. And David has a choice. Will he submit to God? And in the moment, it means to submit to Nathan. Someone who cares, someone who God sent. David could have said, all right, I repent, I submit to God, but I'm not going to submit to you, Nathan. I'm going to find my own way out of this mess. No, God gives us the plan, often through other people. David needed Nathan. Who do you need? Do you have someone? My guess is there probably is someone, but you haven't come to them and said, I need your help. I need you to help lead me, guide me through this process. Surrender your will, submit to God. You must do it in the smaller things before you can ever give God these big things. One last example, and then I'm going to begin to close, and you're going to get to hear a story from someone else. I shared that my thing I'm working on right now is just anger towards my sons, and this unfortunately shows up in something as fun as coaching wrestling. And so I get mad at my boys, and I've been working on this for a number of years, and I thought I was doing better on this, but this struggle showed up again a few weeks ago, and I was mean to the boys again. And at that moment, a couple of the coaches afterwards come up to me, and they share with me, they say, hey, Brian, you're way too hard on your son, Cole. Now, here's the setting for this. I know that this is a thing that wrestling coaches go through. I know this is a thing that dads go through. So I pulled all of my coaches together. I run this club. And I said, hey, when any of us get to this place, we all have permission to talk to one another. And they're like, all right, yeah, we do. And we talk about how difficult it is and how we're going to be right there to help one another. And so I've even invited this feedback. And when it comes, not just because they're caring for Cole, but because I've asked for it, you know how I felt asking someone else for help? You know how I felt having to submit to another person? I felt horrible. I wanted to punch them both in the face. I wanted to say, get out of my face. Who do you think you are? Even though they were absolutely right and I had asked for it. See, it's so hard to have someone like this in your life, but we've got to have it. And so I just kind of politely said, yeah, thanks guys, and walked off mad. But they were right. The next time I saw him, which was 3 days later, I made sure to go up to him and thank them for saying that to me. I needed them to know, and I needed to demonstrate to myself that I was willing to submit to them in an area that I wanted to change. Really what happened is God spoke through them, and I submitted to God by submitting to them. That's what we must do. And so I want to invite my friend Chris Vincent up right now, and he's going to tell us his story. And you're going to get to hear about just the things that he had to endure and how life is different now. But specifically, I asked him also to talk about why step 3 is so difficult for all of us. And Chris, come on up. And he lived in this place where he kind of danced around step 3 for many years. And it kept him from growing, just as most of us do. And I want you to hear from someone who actually got through the difficult steps and has experienced some change in his life. And so, Chris, thank you. This is first service?
Yeah, this is what first service looks like.
That's right.
All right.
Yeah.
Now I know.
And first service is what Chris Vincent looks like.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. As Brian mentioned, my name is Chris Vincent. And about 10 years ago, I woke up to the fact that I was drinking alcoholically, right? It came as something as a surprise to me because in my mind I didn't really fit the mold of what an alcoholic looked like. I was too young. I had a job. I wasn't living under a bridge. I didn't drink out of a bottle that was wrapped in a greasy paper bag. I felt like my condition was a mistake that was playing out in an otherwise pretty well-lived life. So what I did was I just kind of set it aside in the box that Brian is speaking of and decided that it was something that would eventually take care of itself, right? The changes would happen in my life, that I would meet the right girl, or that my job would all of a sudden get a little better, or that my relationship with my parents would improve, and all of a sudden the reasons I had to drink would disappear and I would all of a sudden resume my life normally. Well, that didn't happen. Instead, it was the reverse. Things actually got worse instead of better. And what I noticed was, along with consequences like getting picked up for DUI and going to the emergency room with panic attacks, I began to lie. My dishonesty became rampant, and there was no corner of my life that I wasn't lying to about this condition. My friends, my family, my doctor, my therapist. Can you imagine lying to your therapist, the person that you're paying to talk to? And I found myself waking up one day, looking in the mirror and staring at a person who was so fundamentally dishonest that there was nothing there anymore. There was nothing there. I used to think of myself as a good person who was just making bad choices. And now I was just a guy who made bad choices. And so I woke up and said, you know what? I am an alcoholic, and I'm going to go do something about this. And at that moment, I felt the wind at my back, and I felt like this is the moment that my life is going to change. This is the day that all of a sudden, you know, like the gray clouds are going to part for the sunshine. But what happened was I actually mistaked admission for submission. I thought that simply admitting what I was, admitting how I drank, was the key to unlocking the solution. But I couldn't have been farther from the truth. I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the first thing they said was, get a sponsor, do the steps. And I said, you know what? That's not going to work for me, right? Because I do things a little bit differently. I'm not like your normal alcoholic. You see, like I'm probably a little smarter. I'm probably a little bit more motivated. I'm probably a little bit more professional and a little bit more accomplished. You know, I'm not like the other people in this church basement, right? And so I don't need to do it your way. I don't need to do it with your steps, and I certainly am probably not going to profit by sitting down with a stranger and having them, a person who doesn't know me at all, walk me through this process. Because in actual fact, I know myself better than anyone else. If there's anyone who's going to heal me, it's going to be me. right? And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out and buy a notebook, and I'm going to start writing down the things that I do, and I'm going to start collecting data on myself, and I'm going to start living right. I'm going to start getting to bed on time. I'm going to start going to the gym. I'm going to start eating healthy. Maybe I'm going to lose a little weight. You know what? I'm going to throw in a massage every week because really what I need to do is start taking care of me, right? And with this plan, I'm going to learn more about myself. And in learning more about myself, I'm going to heal myself. And I'd do this plan for 2 weeks, and then I'd find myself in front of a drink, and I'd wake up the next day, and I'd say, oh my God, that plan didn't work. What I need to do is double down. What I need to do is augment the plan, change it slightly. Maybe start going to church. Maybe start coming to Cornerstone. Maybe I'll start going to the gym more. Maybe I'll start buying some books off of Amazon to educate myself more on this process. And this continued for 5 years. I continued to drink and fail and plan and drink again for 5 years. And by the end of 5 years, the rest of my life had become so traumatic, and the pain that I had inflicted on others had become so severe that whatever I was afraid of, as far as submitting to another person, submitting to a sponsor, that didn't matter anymore. I was broken. I'd imagined this life of sobriety was going to be tedious and dull, but that tedium was welcome in comparison to the life I was living. So I finally submitted and said, you know what? I'll do it your way. Do whatever you want. I don't care. I don't know what this is going to look like, but it doesn't matter because I'm not in a place where I have any gas left to fight you. And it was at that moment that the change happened. It was at that moment that I actually started to heal. And as a result of it, my life turned into something that I never dreamed of. That's the piece that I was so taken with when I was sitting here, where I didn't know what I didn't know. I thought life without drinking was going to be kind of this television dinner purgatory, where I was going to come home and I was just going to sit in front of the TV and just be like, okay, I guess I'll just go to bed now and get up and go to work the next day. I didn't know it was going to offer this incredible richness of being part of a fabric of other people that allowed me to then turn around and help another man. I didn't know that I was going to wake up every morning and feel an intense gratitude to God. A gratitude that I had never felt previous. A gratitude that I had never felt even when I didn't understand I had a drinking problem. But it only came through the submission. It only came by getting out of my own way and allowing another person, someone who I chose because they seemed to have what I wanted, and allowing that person to work in my life, and thus God.
Thanks, Chris. You can just put it right there. Thanks, buddy. You're going to hear more stories of people here who, I don't know if what it is, it's courage or desperation. It's a combination of things that pushed on. You're going to hear more of those stories during this series. But we want you to have your own story. And so I'm going to get off here, and these guys are going to lead us with one last song. I want you to know that our prayer team is here to pray for you today. They're going to be in the back and also up here in the front. Here's some things you might want some prayer for, the thing that you're submitting to. Or maybe you just want to have something a tangible way of submitting to God by going to another person and asking for prayer. Or maybe you're like, I know that I'm not desperate yet, but I'm convinced that I need to be. And so you ask someone to pray for you that you'll get there. You'll have a will that you might give up your will. And so whatever that is, there'll be people here to pray for you. These guys are going to lead us. Let's stand together.